This video is sponsored by YouGov.
We like ice cream like every child should.
MCU Phase 4, it has finally come to an end. Thank God. From WandaVision all the way to Wakanda Forever, this was one of the more interesting phases for the MCU because it was a complete and utter mess. For some people, it was an absolute disaster and the end of the MCU. Now, I have made a few videos on MCU Phase 4 products, including She-Hulk and Wakanda Forever, and it's fair to say that I have not been kind to the MCU in general lately. To be honest, I think it's been deserved. Everything from the incoherent storylines, the political messages being shoved down viewers' throats with absolutely no subtlety or nuance, to contradicting tone and character development, to appearing to just have a straight-up identity crisis, Phase 4 has completely missed the mark overall. Shows like She-Hulk, films like Thor: Love and Thunder, complete and utter disappointments that just took the comedy too far for its own good. It hasn't been all bad though. There has been some good in Phase 4, and we're going to dive deep in on this one. We're going to go through each show and film of Phase 4, break down why it contributes to the mess of Phase 4 or why it doesn't, and get to the bottom of exactly why Phase 4 of the MCU sucks and was just a complete and utter mess. This video is sponsored by YouGov, a neat little way that you can earn a little bit of extra cash for taking surveys online. Instead of scrolling TikTok endlessly every night and getting absolutely nothing out of it, you can take some surveys and earn yourself some extra cash, which is something that I tried out when YouGov reached out to me. It's super easy and is a great little something to do when you have some downtime. Plus, you're getting paid for it. Now, YouGov is free to join, and as a member, you'll earn points for giving your opinion by completing short surveys as well as polls. Look, inflation is a big deal and it's on everyone's mind at the moment. YouGov can be a great little way to earn a bit of extra cash in your spare time to help counter that and soften the blow. So be sure to click the link in the description below, take some surveys and earn a little bit of extra cash for yourself, and a big thank you to YouGov for sponsoring this video.
What a neat story.
Black Widow was not a good start to Phase 4 on the film front. Not only is this one of the most forgetful MCU films, but it's a film that anyone will tell you was about 5 years too late. Releasing a long-awaited solo project after the main character dies in an ensemble film is just a mind-blowing decision and contributes nothing to the current MCU. This film should have come out in 2016 or 2017. Having said that, it's not entirely bad. The cast make the film bearable. The addition of Yelena to the MCU is a good one. I've been a big fan of Florence Pugh since Midsommar, and she stole the film for me. But Black Widow serves up one of the worst MCU villains of all time, and in a franchise that has a known villain problem, that's saying something. Look, I can't even say that Black Widow was the right movie at the wrong time because it was the wrong movie at the wrong time. It's harmless to the Black Widow character, sure, but her main storyline lives on just fine without this film in mind. This is just a prime example of the decline of the MCU. There's no rewatchability to this film, not to mention the third act is just ridiculous. The CGI, straight up awful. The CGI is literally evolving backwards here. This was a fairly poor start to the films of Phase 4, but it's not the worst of them. Shang-Chi is a rare Phase 4 Marvel product that I actually don't mind, although it's got issues that are very consistent throughout Phase 4. But this was a breath of fresh air from what was becoming a pretty stale formula. A fusion of Jackie Chan martial arts films of old with Marvel's formula, and it actually kind of worked. Simu Liu provides a likable lead, which is very rare in Phase 4 for various reasons.
Infinitely more than you.
The way the film allowed us to follow Shang-Chi as we uncover his family history, his father, also creating one of the better MCU villains of recent time. Shang-Chi was a rare case of Phase 4 actually creating a product that doesn't feel like it's trying to beat you over the head with its political views. It just creates a fun martial arts action film with great fight sequences. That made me feel like I was watching something like Rush Hour. The fight choreography in this film was so far above anything else in the MCU. There was a CGI fest of a final battle sequence, but it's Marvel. Do we really expect anything less? But then it's got a few downsides. The return of Trevor Slattery, I don't really know why, but okay, I guess you've got to hit your cameo quota. Same with Wong. These are pretty much just an example of Marvel bringing characters back for reasons. Having said that, the character work throughout the runtime was exceptional by Phase 4 standards. Whether it's Shang-Chi, his father, his mother, every major character gets a moment to shine. They don't all feel like afterthoughts like most Phase 4 films and shows. Eternals is just not a very good film. It has some likable characters, it's got some funny moments, but this film was completely undercut by faults in its very own logic and characters that are left severely underdeveloped. Not to mention it tries to go above and beyond in scale, but in true Phase 4 fashion, there seems to be no consequence going forward for the events of Eternals in further Phase 4 films and shows. A Celestial 3 times the size of Earth chilling next to the moon? It's just another day at the office, really. There's a Celestial just hanging out in the middle of the ocean? That's not important. It's a prime example of the MCU just stumbling over their own feet. They want this connected universe thing, but then they don't when it suits their purpose. Like, you can't tell me the things that happened with the Celestials in this film wouldn't be pretty integral going forward and we would have heard a lot more about it. Anyway, Eternals is one of the more bland Marvel products I think I have ever seen. The idea of Icarus being the villain was kind of cool, and I feel like the film could have done a little bit more with him, as I found Icarus to be the best character of the film by far, although it's not really saying much. But Eternals is just the embodiment of a forgetful MCU entry with a generic weak-ass villain. Seriously, what even is the villain of this film's name? I genuinely can't remember. Oh my god, you learn something new every day. Look, Eternals ultimately isn't on the level of like a She-Hulk or anything, but this is without question the most aggressively average film of Phase 4, and as a prime example of a take-it-or-leave-it MCU product, something we'd never really seen before. Spider-Man No Way Home is by far the best film of MCU Phase 4. It's just so far ahead of everything else in this phase and carries it from being the bottom of the barrel. Now, is it a nostalgia-driven dopamine release fest at its core? Yes. But to be honest, I feel like it's one of the rare occasions Marvel has actually pulled off this whole cameo thing that they're so insistent on nowadays. Tobey and Andrew coming back was a cheap move, sure, but there were so many layers to their return. Not only did their appearance improve Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man by adding a sense of closure to unresolved character work from their respective films, but they were used to help progress Tom Holland's Spider-Man along in a big way. Tom Holland's Spidey goes through a larger arc in this film than all of his other MCU entries combined. And it's because Tobey and Andrew were there to help him through the hardships of losing May, to help him through the grief and lessons that come with being Spider-Man from their own experiences. The entire time Tobey and Andrew are in this film, they're teaching Peter new lessons to eventually become the Spider-Man that some fans have felt like Tom Holland's take was not living up to. Tom Holland's Spider-Man in MCU's past has kind of felt like a baby Iron Man, but after No Way Home, it truly felt like Spider-Man. Sure, you can argue Doctor Strange being a dumbass and opening the multiverse over something so minor was, a little bit stupid, but I feel like it's a means to an end. It delivered the fist-pumping moments with familiar characters showing up, but the most important thing is No Way Home made Tom Holland's Spider-Man actually feel like Spider-Man. And for that reason alone, it stands head and shoulders above every other film in Phase 4. Multiverse of Madness is not that great of a film. It's by no means worse than Black Widow or Eternals, but to say I was disappointed when I walked out of the theater would be an understatement. And no, it's not because my anticipated cameo didn't show up, it was because my expectations were high due to Sam Raimi being in the director's chair. Look, this film is by no means bad. It's still well above average, but it could have been better. Wanda as the main villain, I like it. Wanda is one of the more interesting characters in the MCU, and Elizabeth Olsen plays both sides of the character well. When she's being an evil bitch, I believe it. When she's being the Wanda that we know, I believe it. But my god, if I have to hear Wanda's kids sing that song again, I'm going to lose it.
Miss to be good.
I just feel like this film just got incredibly messy. The multiverse idea still needs a lot of work because it was just all over the place here. Multiverse of Madness tells us that the MCU still has no idea what they're doing with this multiverse concept. They haven't quite nailed it yet. Look, I appreciate this film went a little edgier with its violence and it was a more mature MCU film, something that's severely lacking these days. But Multiverse of Madness essentially sums up Phase 4 in a nutshell. It's just an unfocused mess. Thor, Love and Thunder. Oh, here we go. Oh, I hate this movie. This is one of the most disappointing Marvel films I have ever seen. How does a film with a reinvigorated Thor, with Christian Bale as the villain and Taika Waititi in the director's chair, end up being so disappointing? It's truly baffling that I walked out of Love and Thunder not liking this film. All this film did was prove that Thor Ragnarok was lightning in a bottle. Love and Thunder embodies everything that is wrong with the MCU when it comes to comedy specifically. Death by a thousand jokes, it's a real thing in the MCU, and no better is it showcased than with this film. Look, I love Taika Waititi. The dude managed to make a scene of the Gestapo looking for a Jewish girl hilarious in Jojo Rabbit. Like, the dude has a clear knack for comedy and he's incredibly talented, but he took it way too far in this film. Chris Hemsworth, aka my dad, has even said that the tone Love and Thunder provided needs to change if he's gonna come back. Gore had the potential to be such a great villain, and with Christian Bale there, how can you mess that up? Gore is such a tragic and powerful villain, and I can see why Christian Bale was interested in playing the character. But by the film's end, he feels criminally underutilized. And how, just how, can you turn Thor into such a goofball considering where he was in Infinity War? How am I supposed to believe for a second that the Thor who just watched his father die, just watched his sister and Asgard be destroyed, watched Loki die, watched his best friend die, failed at stopping Thanos, to which he leaves with endless amounts of guilt? How does that Thor end up being the Thor that we see in this film? It makes no sense. How are we supposed to believe that this is the same character? This is just a prime example of Phase 4 of the MCU just not being consistent with its character work. Thor's character takes several steps backwards in Love and Thunder. It's like this film was made to just turn your brain off and laugh. Like, there's a fucking dumpling god in this film. Like, is this actually taking the piss? It's like we were just not supposed to think while watching the film. Don't think about the characters, don't think about the story, don't think about what came before, just sit there and laugh, you bunch of simpletons. Love and Thunder was a turning point for the MCU in terms of fans finally realizing that the comedy aspect of the MCU has just gone too far for its own good. Black Panther Wakanda Forever was a good but very, very flawed entry into the MCU. I made a full video analyzing Wakanda Forever, so make sure you check that out if you want to see me dive deeper. But Wakanda Forever simply just tried to make the best of a bad situation. It's probably the second or third best film of Phase 4 of the MCU. Granted, that's not exactly hard. But it was good to see that Phase 4 was capped off with a more mature film. Something that had the MCU comedy of old, but didn't beat you over the head with it. The emotional moments were actually allowed to be emotional. The film had weight behind it, all due to the passing of Chadwick Boseman, which his presence or lack thereof is heavily felt in this film, which works to the film's benefit, but it also works to its detriment. It lets the film pack an emotional punch, which makes it more effective, but it also feels like there is this gaping hole in the film that may make people not like it. It's not as good as the first Black Panther. To be honest, I don't actually think it's even close the more I sit on it. But it showed to me that Marvel can still take a serious tone with their films, and that they can handle a female lead character well, and that Marvel villains can actually still be good after Thanos. It's not a home run, but it's a flawed success.
Yeah, come at me, bro!
Phase 4 kicked off on Disney Plus with WandaVision. To be honest, I think this wasn't even a bad start for Phase 4. This was a pretty decent show. I definitely don't love it as much as most people seem to. WandaVision ultimately was a show based around Wanda controlling or not controlling her grief after the loss of Vision in Infinity War. Ultimately, it's the start of Wanda's villain arc, which continues on in Multiverse of Madness. This is one of the rare cases in Phase 4 where I felt Marvel becoming a little experimental was actually not a complete failure. The idea of each episode reflecting different decades of TV and linking why back to Wanda's childhood in Sokovia. This made us sympathize with Wanda's method of coping with her grief, but it also gives a solid reason for the show to get experimental in the first place. WandaVision was an example of how Marvel can actually try something different, but have it actually work. Unlike with She-Hulk. WandaVision is definitely not dragging Phase 4 down, but it did succumb to the big CGI battle at the end, which was probably the worst thing about the show, but it was a harmless start to Phase 4. The mystery element gave people a reason to keep tuning in week to week, which is something that I cannot say for most of the other Phase 4 Marvel shows. Falcon and the Winter Soldier is a mixed bag of a show. I don't know whether to completely dunk on it or praise it. There are elements to this show that I found were actually great. When we focused on Bucky and his time as the Winter Soldier, how he compartmentalizes the things that he did and the guilt that he lives with, this was great. I would have happily watched this for the entire show's runtime. But in true Phase 4 fashion, this show became very heavy-handed with its political statements. To the show's benefit, some of it actually worked, but some of it didn't.
You've got to do better, Senator.
Everything with Isaiah Bradley I found to be really compelling and prove that Marvel can actually have something to say and have it land. But then the finale happened.
You have to stop calling them terrorists.
Now, I've always liked Sam and Bucky as a duo. It was set up in Civil War, and it was clear from the start that these two could work well together.
Can you move your seat up? No.
I did find it interesting seeing the peek behind the curtain of how people handle daily life after the blip. Sam going to get a loan taken out isn't exactly where I thought this show would go, but it was a peek behind the facade of being a superhero that I think at worst is interesting. But the show ultimately had really poor villains with the Flag Smashers. Like, that is just a shocking name. Seeing Sam take on the mantle was cool. Seeing Zemo again was pretty cool because I actually really liked that character. But at times, this show was straight up boring, and it had a very predictable plot twist. Look, it's by no means a bad show. It dabbles in some cool ideas, but ultimately, most of the ideas don't land the way that they were hoping. Loki is a pretty decent MCU entry, to be honest. Taking a fan favorite character that is beyond his expiry date definitely felt like Kevin Feige collapsing under fan demands of seeing more Loki. But regardless of that, I think this show develops Loki nicely, taking 2012 Loki from Avengers and essentially speedrunning the development that we saw the character go through over the courses of Phase 2 and 3. The scene where Loki sees all of this play out was honestly one of the better scenes of any MCU show. One thing I can't stand about this show though is the TVA and the idea behind it. I just found that it undercut a lot of the weight and the stakes of the MCU so far. Like seeing Infinity Stones as paperweights, it just didn't sit well with me at all. I will say Sylvie was a big surprise in this show. I thought she was great and brought a vulnerability to the character that made her really likable, which likable and female characters in Phase 4, not exactly commonplace.
Infinitely more than you.
Sylvie, on the other hand, was great. Speaking of likable, Owen Wilson in the MCU, whoever casted him, thank you.
Wow.
Obviously, Loki is the first step in the MCU's new overarching story, introducing all these timelines and of course Kang. As a result of that, the show actually felt like it was worth watching, unlike most MCU shows. And to be honest, I think Loki is the best of any of the Marvel shows by far. Hawkeye is one of the biggest meh shows I have seen in recent time. It doesn't do anything profoundly wrong, but it's absolutely an MCU show that you can skip. Did Hawkeye really need a show? No. But they wanted to introduce Kate Bishop. Haley Steinfeld made the character very likable, and she's definitely on the better side of these gender-swapped characters that the MCU keeps doing. And by the show's end, Kate Bishop is a character that I'm happy to see more of. As for Clint, I feel like this character has run its course. Hawkeye's I'm too old for this shit shtick has been going on for a while now, and I'm feeling it as well. It's time to move on. Having said that, it was cool seeing Elena and Clint have an interaction given what happened in Endgame and their relationship with Natasha, so this added something worth watching in a show that just pretty much exists. But honestly, apart from that, this show was a bit of a snooze fest for me. Echo was dead boring, and they're giving her her own show, like... Oh, okay. Kingpin was just not Kingpin. It was just Vincent D'Onofrio back fresh off a vacation from Hawaii. Look, this show isn't awful, but it's so aggressively mediocre that I could never see myself watching it again, which is the case for a lot of Phase 4 films and shows. Moon Knight frustrates the living hell out of me. This show started so well and was by far the best thing I had seen on Disney Plus by a mile. But it lost its way toward the end. Oscar Isaac was incredible in the show. The switching between Mark and Steven and eventually Jake toward the end of the show was really entertaining. And that alone was what got me interested in this show, seeing this person live with this condition. However, I do like the ties to Egyptian mythology. The Moon Knight design is fucking amazing, but the further this show went along, the more it started to unravel into a complete mess, which is something that is very consistent over Phase 4 of the MCU. And by its conclusion, the very essence that made the show so great in the first place was pretty much gone. When Moon Knight was just Stephen battling with his condition, the show was genuinely great. It was compelling. The characters were interesting. But it eventually spiraled into generic CGI fest, big battle finale with a straight up kaiju battle. Like in a show where half of its runtime is spent on mental health, for it to just turn into a kaiju battle at the end, it's like, what? The first half of Moon Knight is genuinely top tier MCU, but the second half is phase 4 of the MCU in a nutshell. Just not good. Look, Miss Marvel, I really don't have much to say about this show, to be honest. This show just was not made for me, but I can still admit when there is objective quality. This is a very decent show. Iman Vellani makes Kamala Khan a likable protagonist, and the strengths of the show absolutely lie with the family. It was cool seeing a look into a culture that personally I knew nothing about, and it never really beat you over the head with it, which is something Phase 4 normally would relentlessly do. The characters in the show were likable, they were believable. The villain, pretty average, which is a real common theme of Phase 4. But they did introduce mutants officially with this show, so I guess there are repercussions going forward, so it feels that this show was actually worthwhile in terms of the overarching MCU. Oh, She-Hulk. This show was something, I tell you. Look, I've spoken at length about this show a couple times on the channel now. She-Hulk is just the perfect embodiment of everything that is wrong with the MCU today. From the ham-fisted politics, the forced comedy not landing, unlikable characters, writers that think they're playing 4D chess but in reality are just not very smart. She-Hulk was a major tipping point for me with the MCU. This is just not a good show. It's a comedy that's just not funny, and that's its #1 problem. And by the time the show reaches its conclusion, you're left sitting there saying, well, what was the point in the entire show? You know, I sat through 9 episodes for the show to just say, well, we wrote ourselves into a corner. We don't know what to do. So let's just, you know, laugh at our own incompetence, condemn the viewer for existing, and then finish the show. But it's okay because we're self-aware. No. This show also highlights a major Phase 4 issue, that being the old cameo your way to a positive reception. She-Hulk sucks? Oh, well, Daredevil will just come and save it. The show's good now. Dude, Daredevil couldn't even save this damn show. It doesn't help that this is supposed to be a legal comedy, but the writers openly admit that they didn't know how to write courtroom scenes. Like, it really makes you think. Every time I think of this show, I think about just how much Marvel has lost their way with Phase 4. This is by far the worst show on Disney Plus and by far the worst product of Phase 4 of the MCU. It highlights perfectly everything that has led to Phase 4 being the worst MCU phase by far. She-Hulk from beginning to end perfectly sums up everything down to the last minute detail that is wrong with the MCU today. So it goes without saying that MCU Phase 4, it was a complete mess. Some of it is genuinely good, some of it is squandered opportunity, some of it is just absolutely awful. It's all over the place. Of course, at the tail end of Phase 4, we did have the additions of Werewolf by Night and the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. These were fun little side projects. I wouldn't say they detract or add anything to the final state of Phase 4, as that's basically just the main films and shows. So Werewolf by Night and Guardians Holiday Special are good, but ultimately just not important in the grand scheme of Phase 4. Now look, every single MCU phase has one bad to average film in it. Phase 1 had Hulk, Phase 2 had Thor the Dark World, Phase 3 had Captain Marvel, and Phase 4 had, well, it had a lot. The key pillars that signify Phase 4 being bad are as follows: oversaturation, forced comedy, politics over story, a lack of focus, and reliance on cameos. You'll probably recognize a few of those things from my first MCU video a few months ago. These issues still plagued Phase 4 all the way up until its end. Without question, the weakest MCU phase so far. The oversaturation of this phase has just proved to MCU fans worldwide that more doesn't always mean better. Quality over quantity is something this franchise still needs to adopt. It seems as if the MCU got to a point where Kevin Feige thought the franchise was just untouchable, impenetrable, so they could just hammer out content like there is no tomorrow and everything would be fine, but that is clearly not working. I'd love to see the MCU adopt the mantra of less is more, because I want to like the MCU. I don't want to see the MCU dwindle away into nothing because it just shoots itself in the foot over and over again. I don't expect the MCU to reach the highs of Infinity War and Endgame again, but I still want to enjoy it. But I just can't when they keep churning out complete rubbish like they did in Phase 4. And going into phases 5 and 6, I hope they start heading back to the direction of less is more, because this quantity over quality approach of phase 4, I believe, is ultimately the biggest factor in why so many things went wrong. So all of this is why MCU Phase 4 sucked and was a complete and utter mess.